I don't think I'll ever forget that flight, or the feeling that followed me even after I touched back down on solid ground. It was supposed to be just another routine business trip, a quick, overnight conference in Chicago, with plans to return the next morning. I'd flown 100 times before without a second thought, but something about this one felt different from the start. The airport was surprisingly empty that night, and even the flight attendants looked tired and annoyed as they directed us toward the gate. I noticed a small group of passengers already boarding, though none of them looked particularly thrilled about the red-eye flight. There was a woman with a toddler who already seemed exhausted, an older man who had been fidgeting with his boarding pass, and a couple of college kids with earbuds jammed in, looking like they'd rather be anywhere else. I slid into my window seat and pulled out my phone to send a few last texts. As I glanced up, a man shuffled down the aisle, stopping abruptly in the row beside mine. He was tall and gaunt, with deep-set eyes and skin that seemed almost gray under the fluorescent lights. His gaze was hollow and unwavering, and when his eyes met mine, I felt a chill run down my spine. He sat down in the aisle seat directly across from me, giving me a faint nod. Trying to shake off the uncomfortable feeling, I focused on settling in for the long flight. I figured I could catch a quick nap after takeoff, but as the plane taxied down the runway and lifted into the sky, I couldn't shake that gnawing feeling. Something wasn't right about this man. There was an intensity in his stillness, as if he were waiting for something, and his eyes, they never closed. I tried to ignore him and turned toward the window, watching the city lights fade as we climbed higher into the darkness. But every so often I glanced back, only to find him staring straight ahead, his gaze unfocused yet somehow aware. The odd part was that no one else seemed to notice. I looked around, but every other passenger seemed lost in their own world, not giving the man a second glance. He wasn't doing anything, not even moving, yet I felt as though he was taking up the entire cabin with his presence. The flight attendants began their rounds, handing out water and pretzels. When they reached his row, the man didn't look up or acknowledge them. The flight attendant paused, looking slightly thrown off, and glanced down at him, but after a moment, she just moved on, her expression blank, as if she hadn't really seen him at all. A creeping sense of dread settled over me, like I was missing something obvious, some terrible truth hovering just out of reach. I tried to close my eyes, but sleep wouldn't come. Instead, I kept my gaze fixed on the seat across the aisle, wondering who he was and why he seemed to haunt every inch of that space. Hours passed in eerie silence, interrupted only by the occasional sound of someone shifting in their seat. Eventually, the captain announced we were beginning our descent. I felt a strange sense of relief, as though I'd been holding my breath the entire flight. The man, however, hadn't moved an inch. The other passengers were starting to wake up, rubbing their eyes and stretching, while he remained unnervingly still. As the plane touched down, my anxiety began to wane. I told myself I'd just been overtired, letting my imagination run wild. We taxied to the gate, and as soon as the seatbelt sign dinged off, everyone started gathering their bags, eager to leave. I stood up, stretching and reaching for my backpack when, out of the corner of my eye, I saw the man still sitting there, staring at the seat in front of him, unmoving. One by one, the other passengers shuffled past, not a single one of them glancing his way or acknowledging his presence. I hesitated, suddenly gripped by a need to understand, to know who he was or why he seemed so out of place. Just as I was about to step into the aisle, a flight attendant approached, giving me a tired smile and gesturing for me to exit, but I couldn't move. I asked her in a low voice, "Is that man okay?" She looked at me, her smile faltering, and then turned to where I was pointing. Her expression turned blank, her eyes glazing over in that same way as before. Slowly she looked back at me, her voice low and almost robotic. "Sir, all passengers have disembarked." I felt my stomach drop. "What? No, that man's right there," I insisted, gesturing wildly to the seat across the aisle. But when I turned, the seat was empty. My breath caught. It didn't make sense. I had watched him sit there, watched him stare, watched him for hours. I felt a wave of nausea rise up as the flight attendant's face softened in sympathy, as if she'd seen this reaction before. Then she said something that made my blood run cold. "It happens sometimes ... on these night flights. You're not the first to think you've seen him." I stumbled down the aisle, my mind reeling. I couldn't get his face out of my head, those empty eyes, that hollow expression. I walked off the plane in a daze, hardly aware of the airport around me. It wasn't until days later, after I couldn't sleep, couldn't focus, that I decided to look up any information I could find. That's when I discovered the story of a man who had vanished on a flight years ago, a night flight bound for Chicago. He'd boarded, but he'd never gotten off. They searched the plane, the airport, everywhere, but he was simply gone. His family had been looking for him for years, but there'd been no trace. The strangest part, every few years, passengers report seeing him on that very same flight, sitting in the same seat, with that same hollow stare. And each time the flight crew has the same response all passengers have disembarked. It's been months now, and I still feel his gaze every time I close my eyes. I still hear the hum of the plane in the silence of my bedroom at night, and I still wonder if, on some night flight, someone else will see him too frozen in time, waiting to finally go home. Chilling enough to have you double-checking your seatmates on your next flight. Story 2. I was never one to be rattled by flying. I'd taken hundreds of flights over the years, long haul, short hops, red eyes, and always found them oddly relaxing. But this one was different, and I still can't make sense of it. They say some flights don't reach their destination for everyone on board. I didn't understand what that meant until that night. It was a last-minute flight, an odd booking made by my manager. Something about a scheduling mix-up had me taking an overnight to Denver. The flight itself was barely half full, just a handful of passengers dispersed throughout the dimly lit cabin. Everything about the night felt strange, as if the airport itself had been asleep and only a few stragglers had wandered aboard this flight. I remember checking my boarding pass 3 times, wondering if I'd made a mistake because the gate was nearly empty when I arrived. The plane's cabin was cloaked in darkness, the windows showing nothing but endless black outside, the seats stretching into an abyss behind me. My seat was near the back, an aisle seat in a row that I thought I'd have to myself. But just as I settled in, I noticed someone across the aisle, a young woman with wild, sleep-tangled hair and a haunted look in her eyes. She stared straight ahead, barely blinking, her hands clenched so tightly on her lap that her knuckles were white. As we took off, I felt that familiar tug of nerves. I figured she was just an anxious flyer and turned my gaze back to the darkened cabin, trying to ignore the strange, unsettled feeling gnawing at me. The other passengers were spread out, some asleep, others tapping on phones or reading. For some reason, the woman's presence kept pulling my attention. She didn't move, didn't even shift in her seat as the plane climbed, her stare fixed forward as if she was trying to keep her mind elsewhere. An hour into the flight, I was feeling restless. I kept telling myself to relax, that it was just a routine trip. But I couldn't stop glancing over at her, unnerved by how she hadn't moved, hadn't shifted, hadn't even closed her eyes. I looked around, trying to catch sight of the flight attendants, but I hadn't seen a single one since we'd boarded. There hadn't been the usual announcements, no in-flight service, not even a pre-flight check. And something about that absence gnawed at me, made the air feel heavy, like the oxygen was draining from the cabin. As I sat there, that same young woman began to murmur under her breath. Her lips moved rapidly, as if she was praying or reciting something. I strained to hear, but the words didn't make any sense. They were jumbled, an erratic whisper that sounded like a desperate mantra. Goosebumps prickled down my arms and I tried to ignore it, but a voice in the back of my mind kept urging me to look around, to pay attention to the other passengers. My stomach dropped as I looked to the rows ahead, seeing their faces illuminated by the faint glow of reading lights and phone screens. They were all eerily still. One woman near the front had her head tilted back at an unnatural angle, her mouth slightly open, eyes barely slits, as if she were asleep or something else. Another man a few rows up sat completely upright, his eyes open and vacant, staring directly at the seat in front of him. It was as if they were frozen, caught in some kind of trance. My heart began to race as the cabin lights flickered, briefly plunging everything into pitch black before a faint hum of the emergency lights kicked in. A small, claustrophobic feeling crept over me as I strained to see anything, my eyes adjusting slowly. And then, without warning, I saw movement in the back. A figure thin, almost skeletal, draped in the shadows was gliding up the aisle. The figure's face was shrouded in darkness, just a hint of hollow eyes barely visible beneath a messy curtain of hair. I couldn't look away, my heart pounding as it approached, drifting between the seats, pausing at each row to stare blankly at the passengers, one by one. My eyes locked onto it as it drew nearer. It moved without sound, just a chilling presence that seemed to sap all warmth from the cabin. And then, in one terrifying moment, its gaze snapped toward me. I froze, my mouth dry, the words dying on my lips as I tried to call out. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. It was as if the air itself had turned solid, trapping me in place, as that figure stared right through me, those hollow, unblinking eyes pinning me down. And then, just as quickly, it turned away and continued its path down the aisle. The young woman across from me seemed to shudder, as if she, too, had felt its cold stare, her murmuring growing louder, more frantic. I wanted to reach out, to shake her, to wake her up from whatever trance she was in, but my own body refused to cooperate. I was locked in my seat, my heart pounding so hard I thought it would burst. I don't remember when or how I finally dozed off. One moment I was staring down the empty aisle, listening to that whispered chant, and the next, I was jolted awake by a voice over the intercom. My heart raced as I glanced around, relieved to see daylight streaming through the windows. The other passengers were stirring, yawning, stretching as if nothing had happened. I looked to my side, only to see the young woman gone, her seat empty and untouched. Dazed and confused, I gathered my things and made my way off the plane, eager to get away from that suffocating cabin. The terminal was bright, bustling, full of the usual noise and chatter of travelers. It felt surreal, almost like stepping back into reality after a strange nightmare. But as I walked through the terminal, I passed a row of screens displaying flights and couldn't resist glancing at our flight number. That's when my blood ran cold. The screen showed our flight, all right, but the details were all wrong. The plane hadn't arrived today, it had arrived yesterday, over 24 hours earlier than I'd landed. The flight was marked as arrived with a note next to it, diverted due to in-flight emergency. I tried to make sense of it, but nothing clicked. The time, the date, everything was off. In a daze, I approached the information desk, my words barely coming out as I asked if there had been a flight arriving from Denver that morning. The attendant looked at me strangely, as if I were asking about a ghost. "Sir," she said, after checking her screen, "that flight never landed. They were forced to turn back after an emergency. The records show. No one arrived here from that flight. It was empty when they returned." I stood there, unable to speak, the world spinning around me. The flight, the passengers, the woman, that figure in the aisle, none of it was supposed to be real. But here I was, haunted by something I couldn't explain, with the eerie feeling that I had left a part of myself on that plane, somewhere between the sky and the ground. Now, every time I see a plane in the sky, a cold chill runs through me. I wonder if it's still up there, still gliding through the night with a cabin full of silent passengers, each one trapped in that strange, empty journey, bound for nowhere. Story 3. They say there's a first time for everything, and for me, that was flying across the country alone. I'd always been a nervous flyer, but I had my noise-canceling headphones, a good book, and an aisle seat I'd scored after a last-minute upgrade. For the first time, I actually felt calm about the whole thing, or so I thought. The flight was packed, with everyone jostling around trying to find overhead space and seats. I stowed my backpack, buckled in, and settled back with a sigh, ready to get through the next few hours with as little anxiety as possible. The middle seat next to me was empty, which was a rare perk. Just as I was getting comfortable, I saw a man heading down the aisle. He was wearing an old coat that looked a little too heavy for the season and carrying a small, worn bag. His hair was messy, his face pale, and his eyes dark-rimmed. as if he hadn't slept in days. He stopped at my row, glanced down at his boarding pass, and then looked up at me. "Excuse me," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper as he gestured to the middle seat, 23 billion. I nodded, shifting a little as he slid in next to me. As soon as he sat down, a strange chill seemed to settle over the row. I thought it might be the vent, but even after I adjusted it, that cold sensation stayed. I figured he was probably exhausted, but something about his presence made the hairs on my arm stand on end. He was very still, hands resting tightly on his knees, his gaze straight ahead, as if he were focusing on some distant point. The rest of the passengers settled, and soon enough we were in the air. The usual pre-flight nerves faded as I lost myself in my book, relieved to have something to distract me. I noticed the man next to me hadn't even moved, not even to glance out the window or shift in his seat. Just sitting with that same eerie stillness, staring ahead like he was barely breathing. 2 hours into the flight, the crew began serving drinks and snacks. When they got to our row, the attendant asked him if he wanted anything. He didn't answer, didn't even acknowledge her. She waited, then glanced at me, and I shrugged. She quickly moved on, but I couldn't help glancing over at him, wondering if maybe he'd fallen asleep with his eyes open. I was debating whether to say something when he turned his head slightly toward me, his eyes catching mine. They were dark, hollow, like something you'd see in an old photograph where the face has faded out. My heart skipped a beat as he looked at me, and he whispered, "Do you believe in second chances?" I blinked, caught off guard, wondering if I'd misheard him. But he was staring at me, eyes unblinking, waiting for an answer. Feeling uneasy, I forced a smile and nodded, not really knowing what else to say. He didn't react, just turned back to face forward, his expression blank and detached. After that, I tried to focus on my book, but I couldn't get comfortable. The cold from earlier seemed worse now, and I started to feel a dull headache settling behind my eyes. Every few minutes I'd glance over at him, but he never moved, never spoke again. Eventually I closed my eyes, hoping I could sleep through the rest of the flight. I'm not sure how long I'd been out when I felt a light touch on my shoulder. I woke up to see a flight attendant bending over, her face pale and worried. "Sir," she said quietly, "we need to check on the passenger next to you. Can you please step into the aisle?" Groggy and disoriented, I nodded and unbuckled, sliding out of my seat. I glanced down at the man as I stood up. His head was tilted slightly back, eyes still open, hands clutching his knees, just as they had been before. A second flight attendant had joined her, and the two of them exchanged a look. I could feel something was very wrong, a heaviness in the air around us. The other passengers were now looking over, curious, some even standing to get a better view. One of the attendants reached out, gently touching his shoulder, then shook him slightly. Nothing. He didn't move, didn't blink. She shook him harder this time, her voice slightly louder as she repeated, "Sir." That's when I noticed the slight grayish tint to his skin, the sunken hollows under his eyes. He looked as though he hadn't taken a single breath since he'd sat down. I felt my stomach drop, a sickening realization setting in. The attendant pulled back her hand, her face paling further. She whispered something into her radio, and within minutes, they were escorting me and everyone else from our row to the front of the plane, away from him. I was in shock, staring at the floor as one of the attendants whispered to me that they believed he'd passed away sometime during the flight. The rest of the flight was a blur. The crew handled everything quietly, discreetly, trying to keep the other passengers calm. I barely remember landing, just the feeling of dread as I walked off the plane, that coldness still clinging to my skin like a shadow. But what happened afterward? That's what I can't get out of my mind. When I was finally back in the airport, an airline employee approached me, asking if I'd be willing to answer a few questions. I followed him to a small office, numb and exhausted, half wondering if it had all been a dream. They asked me to describe the man, to go over every detail I remembered. As I talked, I noticed a strange expression on the employee's face, a mix of pity and something else, something like disbelief. When I finished, he paused, and after a long silence, he finally spoke. "We've had a few reports." similar to this before he said quietly, choosing his words carefully, about a man in seat 23 billion. According to what we know, a passenger matching that description died in that seat over a year ago on a flight to Denver. There was some medical emergency, and he didn't make it. I felt the room spin around me as his words sank in. I wanted to laugh, to tell him it was impossible, that I'd seen the man, heard him speak. But I couldn't say anything. The memory of his hollow eyes, that strange question, do you believe in second chances? It all felt too real. I left the office in a daze, half expecting to see the man walking through the terminal, but of course he wasn't there. I've tried to move on, to tell myself it was just my mind playing tricks, just a coincidence. But every time I book a flight, I can't help but check the seating map to make sure I'm not anywhere near seat 23 billion. I can't shake the feeling that if I ever sat there again, I might find myself face to face with him once more, asking me that same haunting question. Now, whenever I fly, I avoid the back of the plane, because some part of me is certain that he's still there, waiting, trapped in that final moment, searching for something, or someone willing to believe in second chances.